Some nights the thought arrives before sleep, quiet as dust on the windowsill. Walk away. Not tomorrow, not after a promotion, not when the timing looks respectable. Just stand up, close the door behind me, and let this version of my life expire like a forgotten tab in a browser. The fantasy grows in small details. A ticket bought with a name that still belongs to me, but feels unclaimed. One suitcase that closes without effort, because most of what fills this apartment never belonged to my heart anyway. A room in a strange city where no one expects a joke, a reply, a meeting, a performance. Work would send emails stacked like bricks. Family would call, at first with worry, later with tight, polite anger. Messages would pile up in places I no longer visit. The world would keep turning, well-fed and well-lit, almost offended that a single unpaid bill decided to wander off script. The thought presses against the inside of my skull on crowded trains. Bodies lean into each other, faces lit blue by tiny screens, and it feels like standing inside an aquarium stacked with glass boxes. Everyone reaching, scrolling, narrating their survival in real time. My own reflection hovers between them, ghosted by fingerprints and flickering ads. Walk away. Not as a grand gesture, more like slipping out of a boring movie through a side door while the hero gives another speech about courage. Out into the hallway where the air smells like dust and old candy wrappers, where silence hangs with its sleeves rolled up. A small room in another country. A different language brushing against my ears like rain on metal. No one with a stored copy of my mistakes. No one with a childhood version of me framed in their memory. The body understands the temptation before any noble explanation arrives. Shoulders loosen at the idea. Jaw unclenches. Breath finally drops out of the chest into the stomach, heavy and simple. The word for it sounds dramatic when spoken out loud. Disappear. On the inside, it feels less like vanishing and more like taking off a costume that refused to admit it ever came with a zipper. The urge did not begin in an office under fluorescent light. As a child, the first escape route lived between school and home, in the thin strip of street where no one's eyes followed. That small corridor of freedom smelled like bread from the corner bakery and wet concrete after rain. Steps slowed there. A small body, backpack pulling at the shoulders, studying the idea of walking past the apartment gate and not turning in. Teachers praised quiet obedience. Parents celebrated good grades and uncomplaining routines. Every adult loved the child who fit neatly into expectations. The world clapped for furniture that never moved itself. Inside that applause, something small tightened around the ribs, an invisible belt teaching the lungs how to behave. Homework, chores, early sleep. The days stacked like identical plates. Questions about what lived beyond the neighborhood arrived late at night, staring at the ceiling, tracing invisible routes with bare feet against the sheet. Roads that did not circle back to the same front door. Train lines that kept going until the map folded on itself. The first fantasy was simple, a different city with the same sun. A place where no one from school whispered about mistakes made in third grade, where no neighbor carried an archive of family arguments in their eyes. A place where footsteps did not echo a last name that already felt too heavy for a small chest. Adolescence pressed more weight into the skin. Expectations picked up new uniforms. Pick a respectable career, move upward, never sideways, never away. Dreams about leaving turned into jokes shared late with friends, each of us promising to run to some far coast once the next exam ended. The laughter sounded wild, brave, almost heroic. Nobody moved. Instead, the promise of departure went into storage with childhood toys, sealed in a box labeled later. Study, graduate, endure. Trade the fantasy of escape for a future where travel happens on approved holidays, booked well in advance. Return ticket printed before the suitcase opens. Adulthood arrived wearing a tie and a polite tone. The invisible belt around the ribs adjusted itself, sophisticated, matching the color of the office chair. The world called it responsibility. The body called it something else, though no word stepped forward yet. The fantasy of disappearing did not vanish, it changed clothes. It stopped looking like a child running away with a backpack and started looking like a professional catching a flight for a conference and deciding at the last moment not to come back. Work became the place where escape rehearsed in slow motion. Morning started with alarms that did not ask for consent. Coffee burned its way down the throat, a liquid negotiation between exhaustion and duty. Screens flickered awake, calendars filled with other people's urgencies, and the day stretched out like a tunnel with fluorescent ribs. Colleagues learned the helpful version of me quickly. Reliable responses, careful humor, a talent for carrying pieces of broken projects until they looked whole enough for someone higher up to sign. In meetings, words left my mouth on time and in the right order. Heads nodded, notes were taken. No one asked what these sentences cost the rest of the body. The desk turned into a little altar to survival. Headphones to drown out office noise, a mug with a chipped edge, a plant fighting quietly for light. Hours slid past in emails, revisions, calls where faces floated in tiny squares and stared slightly off camera, as if searching for a better life just beyond the screen. During those calls, the fantasy of disappearing worked like a background app. While numbers and deadlines danced on the surface, another story played underneath. The same body in a different chair, by a window looking over a foreign street, laptop closed, shoulders bare to the afternoon air. No notification bubble climbing the corner of the glass. Silence in a life like that would not feel like failure. It would feel like air reclaiming the space sound once occupied. Around lunch, the building's cafeteria filled with cutlery noise and half-finished conversations. People described new series, minor scandals, weekend plans. Laughter bounced off white walls, well-behaved, never staying long enough to stain anything. Smiles performed their duty, jokes arrived on cue. Under the table, one foot tapped out a code only the leg understood. Not belonging, not belonging, not belonging. The thought of walking out without returning liked to visit in those fluorescent afternoons. Stand up, leave the badge on the desk, let the elevator doors close behind this identity. Step into the street under an ordinary sky, but aim the feet somewhere the map of routine never marks in blue. Work courted burnout when bodies finally sagged under the weight. HR printed pamphlets and suggested apps that taught breathing as if lungs had not been practicing since birth. The word sounded technical, almost mechanical, like a light bulb flickering at the end of its life. Inside, the condition carried a different name, a slow erasure. Edges of self rubbed away by endless context, switching and compulsory enthusiasm, until only a faint outline remained, polite and tired. In that outline, the desire to disappear did not feel dramatic. It felt like the most reasonable request in the room. Outside of work, the world promised connection and delivered its echo. Dating apps lined up faces like products on a conveyor belt, each profile carefully edited to highlight peak moments. Beaches, dim restaurants, gym mirrors capturing well-trained silhouettes. Swipes moved left and right in the dark, thumb muscles learning a choreography faster than the heart could keep pace. Matches appeared, conversations sparked, then faded. Messages sank under the weight of new notifications, attention stretched thinner than phone glass, plans formed, rescheduled, vanished. Sometimes a night out ended with shared stories and warm laughter. More often it ended with the gentle, numbing blur of small talk rehearsed too many times. In crowded bars, music pressed against the chest, heavy and insistent. Voices competed with bass lines. Jokes shouted across tables, names repeated again and again until they lost flavor. Eyes drifted over shoulders toward exits, toward streets washed in sodium light, toward anywhere the air moved more slowly. On social feeds, acquaintances displayed curated affection, anniversaries under fairy lights, vacations staged against harmless oceans, captions about gratitude and growth. Each image carried a subtle verdict, a reminder that other people had found a script worth posting, while daily life here felt more like a rehearsal that never reached opening night. Loneliness did not arrive as empty rooms. It walked in wearing company. Group chats buzzing with memes, meetings stacked back to back. Bodies pressed together on public transport, sharing oxygen, never histories. 1,000 chances for contact without the promise of being known. The urge to disappear grew teeth in that crowd, not to run from love, but from its theater, from the constant auditioning, from the way every interaction seemed to demand proof of worth, proof of novelty, proof that time with this face, this voice, this past would not be wasted. Silent fantasies built alternate lives in far-off places. A small apartment overlooking a canal where nobody speaks the old language around the corner shop. A coastal town where evenings end with the sea folding over itself in slow applause instead of with screens glowing against bedroom walls. Cafes where no one asks about career progression, only whether the chair beside them is empty. The body does a strange thing while those images unroll. Muscles soften, breathing steadies, jaw unclenches. A warmth spreads behind the sternum, as if someone opened a window in a crowded train and let cold air rush over overheated skin. The dream of vanishing does not shout, it whispers, "Leave the stage, walk into the dark where no spotlight hunts you." Maybe, in that darkness, something gentler waits. At some point, the fantasy stops being a vague mist and becomes a blueprint. A secret folder on the laptop collects screenshots of rental listings in distant cities. Notes app entries hold currency conversions, visa requirements, lists of professions that might hire a stranger with a foreign name and an invisible history. Flight comparison tabs multiply like thoughts at 3 in the morning. One route stands out, a plane that leaves close to midnight, crossing time zones while most of the world sleeps. Departure time circled in the mind, not on any calendar. The imagined version of me boards with a single carry-on, clothes rolled tight, passport warm against the chest. No public announcement, no farewell party, no final tour of old haunts. Bank accounts become numbers in equations scribbled on mental walls. How many months of rent could this balance buy in that seaside town? How long before savings thin out enough to force another compromise with reality? What skills transfer across borders when the main export has always been reliability and silence? The plan covers practicalities: cancel subscriptions, close accounts, forward essential mail to a neutral address, leave a short message to family, vague enough to calm panic, clear enough to break expectations. Texts to friends left unsent in drafts, words hovering on the edge between explanation and apology. A life reduced to items that fit in a suitcase suddenly reveals how much of it was padding. Clothes unworn for years, souvenirs from trips that did not leave a mark on the soul. Books kept for a version of me who always promised to have more time later. Objects cling to their shelves with the stubbornness of barnacles on a rusted hull. Imagining their absence feels less like loss and more like cleaning a wound. The most dangerous part of the blueprint is not the logistics, it is the emotional rehearsal. After enough late-night sessions, another city no longer feels like a dream, but like a parallel timeline running alongside this one, waiting for the smallest decision to switch the tracks. A turn at the airport, a bag packed instead of left open on the bed. In that parallel life, mornings begin with unfamiliar smells from street vendors instead of the burnt tang of office coffee. People speak in patterns that wash over the years as sound before they harden into meaning. No one carries stories about my childhood, my failures, my almost successes. The past dissolves into a few sentences delivered to new acquaintances over cheap beer. I left because the old life became too small. This sentence glows in the dark like a sign above an emergency exit. The blueprint never mentions the weight of starting again with no one to hold memory. It edits out sickness, far from family. Paperwork in a language that slices the tongue. Late nights where the only familiar shape in the room is the outline of my own doubt. That silence inside the plan is the loudest part. Reality, inconvenient as always, keeps sending proofs of gravity. Workdays lengthen as teams shrink. Offices learn to celebrate surviving with fewer people by pouring more tasks into the ones who remain. Praise arrives in emails for stepping up, a polite ribbon tied around quiet exploitation. Sleep shortens. Meals blur into snacks consumed over keyboards. Stories float through the grapevine about colleagues who reach their limit. Some announce their departure with brave posts about new adventures. Others simply stop appearing on screens, their icons going dark, their tasks quietly redistributed. Their names turn into references in conversations. Someone who used to sit here, used to handle that, used to answer late-night emergencies. Health articles circulate online about burnout, anxiety, stress injuries to the mind. Experts talk about chronic exhaustion, depersonalization, the loss of meaning in work. The language tastes clinical, smooth, almost sterile, like hospital corridors bleached of smell. Inside the chest, the experience feels more primitive, closer to weather than illness. A slow winter settling over the bones, promising no clear end. Men's mental health becomes a trending topic in headlines and thumbnail faces. Videos speak about silent despair, about stigmas, about breaking the culture of toughness. On screen, hosts explain that many men reach a point where disappearing seems easier than admitting weakness. Comments fill with confessions from strangers who describe the same late-night fantasies of walking away from everything. Each confession reads like a version of my own journal written by different hands. The awareness that others share this urge cuts two ways. On one side, relief, the mind is not uniquely broken. On the other, dread, an entire generation quietly rehearsing routes out of their own lives, not toward death but toward ghosts wearing their names. Quiet quitting enters the vocabulary. Articles analyzing how workers pull back effort to protect whatever remains of their sanity. Employers treat it as a problem to manage. For the body living inside it, quiet quitting feels less like rebellion and more like a survival reflex, nerves shutting down to avoid overload. In the middle of this, the fantasy of disappearing sharpens. Not just leaving a company, but stepping sideways out of a whole culture that weighs worth in output and availability. A culture that treats stillness as laziness, solitude as failure, saying no as lack of ambition. The temptation whispers an alternative, a small life somewhere else, unremarkable, untracked, unperformed. A job that pays enough to eat and keep a roof overhead, nothing more glamorous than that. Evenings defined by weather and neighbors instead of metrics and messages. Freedom in that picture looks very small and impossibly bright. For all its detail, the escape plan stops at one door. The question waits on the threshold, like a suitcase that refuses to roll forward. What exactly escapes? The job, certainly. The city, with its familiar corners that pinch old memories. The social circles that orbit around schedules and shared complaints. All of that can be abandoned with enough paperwork and nerve. The self, though, packs itself into carry-ons with quiet efficiency. The habit of overcommitting to prove worth does not stay behind at the old office. It walks through customs wearing the same smile. The instinct to apologize for existing in someone else's way travels without needing a visa. The terror of disappointing people clings to the back of the throat like a swallowed stone. A different city might offer new streets to wander at night, but the same thoughts would trail behind, matching their pace easily. The realization arrives not as an insight, but as an ache. Sitting alone at the desk, browser filled with open tabs about distant neighborhoods, a heaviness wraps around the shoulders. Leaving could clean the stage, sweep the props away, change the lighting. The actor remains. What the fantasy of disappearing truly craves begins to show itself in pieces. rest that does not have to be justified, silence that is not interpreted as failure, relationships where absence does not instantly trigger accusations, where presence is not constantly evaluated against some invisible standard of usefulness. The yearning reaches deeper than geography. It presses against the rules written in childhood. Be good, be helpful, be impressive, be grateful, be quiet about what hurts. Those commandments built the person who now dreams of melting into a crowd in a foreign train station. Perhaps the wish is not to vanish from the world, but to step away from a role that devours everything else, a life where saying no does not feel like treason, where taking a day off does not require a story about sickness or emergencies, where existing in a room without entertaining anyone is acceptable. The blueprint on the screen flickers. Flight prices update, rental listings expire, visa regulations shift subtly. The plan requires constant maintenance, like a garden that yields only potential. Beneath the surface, another option sprouts, fragile and stubborn. Instead of erasing the old life with one dramatic disappearance, start deleting smaller things that quietly erase me. Not as cinematic. Far more difficult, more honest. The first experiment in disappearing differently begins not with an airplane ticket, but with a boundary. One evening, a message vibrates against the table. A familiar request wrapped in friendly words. A favor at work that slides beyond the paid hours, beyond the written role. Fingers hover over the screen, trained to type an automatic yes, the response that has protected reputation for years. The word that leaves instead is short, almost weightless. No. Heartbeats thud in the throat after sending it, as if some law of gravity has been broken. Images of consequences line up quickly. Disappointment, gossip, cold shoulders in the office kitchen. The old reflex whispers that survival depends on being agreeable, available, endlessly patient. Hours pass. The world fails to shatter. Another experiment follows. A weekend stays empty in the calendar on purpose. Invitations receive polite refusals. The days unfold without obligations, unfamiliar in their quiet. Time stretches, awkward at first, like wearing clothes one size too big. Gradually, the body learns to breathe into the extra space. Phone notifications shrink. Some people drift toward others who answer faster, laugh louder, carry more of the conversational weight. The circle of constant contact contracts, and in its place grows something stranger, pockets of solitude chosen rather than imposed. Walks without destination replace rushed commutes. Trees that once appeared only as blurred strokes outside bus windows now have individual shapes, stubborn branches, small scars. The city reveals corners that never mattered when every step served a schedule. Therapy might enter the frame, or long conversations with someone who listens without turning every confession into a lesson. Words long buried under phrases like, "It's fine," and "No big deal," climb up, blinking in the light. Stories about exhaustion, about romantic failures, about secret fears of ending up old and invisible in a rented room. Saying these things aloud does not fix anything overnight. No magical clarity erupts, yet the urge to vanish shifts its angle. What once aimed outward, toward distant coastlines and anonymous hostels, starts turning inward toward the parts of life that swallow identity whole. Social media apps quietly leave the phone, one by one. The emptiness where their icons once sat feels unsettling at first, a blank patch like skin, freshly freed from a plaster. Later, that same emptiness tastes like room to breathe. Work boundaries strengthened by degrees. Logging off at a reasonable hour, letting emails wait until morning, refusing to treat every ping as a fire alarm. Small rebellions that would barely register from the outside, yet inside they sound like the first stones knocked loose from a prison wall. The desire to disappear does not die. It becomes more precise. Not escape from existence, but escape from versions of living that consume more life than they offer. The old dream of boarding a plane with a one-way ticket never entirely fades. It waits on the horizon like a distant shore, possible, unreachable only by choice. Knowing it could be done becomes its own kind of freedom. Yet something shifts in the daily texture of staying. Mornings still arrive with their modest violence, alarms cutting through sleep, responsibilities queuing up. The difference lies in the number of doors locked from the inside. A calendar no longer surrendered entirely to other people's priorities. A phone that can remain face down without guilt swallowing the room. Work that receives honest effort, but no longer a sacrificial altar stacked with every spare hour. Conversations begin to change as well. When someone asks how things are going, the answer sometimes steps away from the usual script. Not fine, not great, just honest. Explanations emerge about exhaustion, about the weight of pretending ease, about the nights spent planning disappearances instead of resting. Some listeners flinch, others lean closer. A few offer their own versions of the same confession, voices dropping as if sharing contraband. Quiet brotherhood forms in those moments, thin but real. The fantasy of vanishing no longer stands alone in the dark, it shares space with other possibilities. Taking a sabbatical instead of quitting in a blaze. Move into a different role or field rather than throwing the entire career into the sea. Relocating to a smaller city without severing every tie at once. Each option lacks the romantic purity of a clean break. Each one, however, honors the truth that escape without transformation only rearranges the furniture of misery. Standing at the window of the same apartment once dreamed of as a temporary container, the city spreads out in its usual mess of lights and noise. Somewhere out there, people are buying tickets to leave, others are returning with overstuffed luggage, and many are simply trying to make peace with the small radius of their lives. The thought returns, familiar as always. Walk away. Another voice has grown beside it, quieter but steadier. Stay, but not like this. Maybe the real disappearance already began. The version of me that agreed to every demand without question has started to thin out, like smoke after a match burns down. The person who believed worth depended on constant performance steps back, one pace, then another. What remains is not a heroic survivor or a tragic figure. Just a human being standing in the middle of a life, finally admitting the weight of it. If disappearing once meant erasing every trace and starting from zero somewhere no one knew the name, a different meaning settles in now, a softer one. Let the parts that hurt without purpose vanish. Let the habits that hollow out the chest dissolve. Let the need to prove existence every second to everyone fade like a bad signal. The rest can stay, messy, unfinished, imperfect, but here, under the same sky, in the same city, with the same name whispered back from the mirror, something unclenches. The body recognizes a kind of arrival, not at a new destination, but as a life where walking away no longer feels like the only door left open.